This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Welcome everybody to the Geography of U.S. Presidential Elections, and welcome everybody who will be seeing this or listening to it on iTunes University. As you can see, it's being taped and recorded, and I would like to thank the people at iTunes University and at Stanford Video and people at Continuing Studies as well for making this possible. My name is Martin Lewis. I teach in the history department here at Stanford. Some of you have taken some of my other courses. I recognize some faces out there, and in fact, a gentleman in the front row actually recommended that I teach this class, so we owe it to him that we have the class here today. Those of you who have taken my other classes know that I love maps, just about everything about maps. I like the way they look, I like the patterns that they show. And one thing that I like about elections, especially US presidential elections, is the wealth of maps, the cartographic resources that come with it. It gives us a lot to chew on. Not just US elections, but other elections as well. We find the same sort of thing. And one pattern that we can generalize about is that if a country like Ukraine here in 2004 has a stark geographical division, with districts over here voting 90% for Viktor Yanukovych, districts over here, well, up to 96% for Viktor Yushchenko, you know there are some problems in that country. We've seen some problems in Georgia. Well, watch Ukraine. It could be much worse, where we have the pro-Russian half of the country, the eastern and southern half, starkly divided from the pro-Western western half of the country. Another place where we've seen something quite similar is in Bolivia. I'm sorry, the map is pretty fuzzy, but this was the election where Evo Morales won. In the highlands, where most of the population is Quechua or Aymara speaking, you can see winning over 80–90% in many districts. In the lowlands, with a few exceptions, his opponent winning by equal numbers. And Bolivia now is on the brink. The more prosperous lowlands in the east are pushing for autonomy. Some people question the future of Bolivia. The United States, well, we've seen it before. We saw it in 1860. This map doesn't show it that well. You can see a swath of states voting for Lincoln, a swath of states in the South voting for John Breckinridge, and the border states going different ways. Where you can really see the election of 1860, and again, I'll apologize for the map. It might be a little bit hard to read, but if you go down to county level data, and what we find is actually there were two parallel elections in the United States that year. The Democratic Party had split, basically over the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision. The Southern Democrats walked out of the convention, so there were two Democrats running, Stephen Douglas and John Breckinridge, basically one running in the North and the other in the South. Lincoln, representing the new Republican Party, wasn't even on the ballot in the South. And these green counties in the South are sort of the remnants of the old Whig Party. They call themselves they call themselves the Unionist Party, and their platform is just basically keep the Union. Let's not talk about slavery or these other sorts of problems. Although Lincoln only got votes in the northern half of the country, that's where most of the population was, he won. Here he was, a one-term congressman, self-educated lawyer defeating a vice president, the most powerful man in the Senate, and a former Speaker of the House. Well, obviously, that set up the Civil War. Now, some people say that the United States right now has deep divisions. Not this deep, obviously, but some observers look at the political scene and find some things to be worried about. Certainly in the election that's going on right now, we see a lot of animosity between supporters of both political parties. Actually, in the last week, it is seeming to have intensified. Some people look at that and are worried. But political scientists and political geographers debate about this issue. How polarized really is the United States, and how geographically structured are those polarities? Here's just some covers of a couple of recent books. Polarized America, The Dance of Ideology and Unequal Riches, versus Stanford political scientist Morris Fiorina writing Culture War, The Myth of a Polarized America. Fiorina argues that, yes, there's a lot of polarization, but it's mostly among what he calls the political classes. That actually, if you look at a lot of public opinion polling, you find that most Americans would put themselves somewhat in the center. Actually, a 2004 fairly large-scale public opinion poll found that 45% of Americans classified themselves as centrists or moderates, 21% as liberals, 33% as conservatives. You add it all up, that only gives 1% for radicals and extremists of all sorts. Seems low, but I guess people don't want to classify themselves as such. And of course, it all depends on how you ask these questions, what sort of thing you get, and different pollsters come up with different numbers. But actually, a lot of evidence suggests that many people in the US are at the center. Political strategists, though, wonder how to deal with this polarization or lack thereof. In 2004, the well-known Republican political strategist Matthew Dowd decided that the middle ground was so small and there were so few undecided voters or swing voters that one could win an election just by focusing on the base and getting out the vote. That was successful. That same strategy seems to be followed today by the McCain campaign. Doesn't seem to be working so well. The question is, they misjudged the center of the US, or have conditions changed? Have voters changed? Has the economy changed? Well, there's a lot going into it, and we can't obviously figure it all out quite so easily. My question is, how geographically structured is this polarity? Because we know there is a large degree of polarization. And there's more polarization now than there was 20 years ago, certainly more than there was in the 1950s and early 1960s, a period when polarization was relatively low. It is commonly portrayed as a polarity that is starkly structured on spatial lines with what I sometimes call the map of red and blue America. A map that looks back at the 2004, actually very similar though in the 2000 election, showing the states that voted for the Democratic candidate in blue, those for the Republican candidate in red. I'm sure you've all seen this, but we see one is a lot of geographical clumping, right? We see a continuous swath of red states, and we see the blue states in 3 different areas. In the Northeast, New England and the Mid-Atlantic states, in what we might call the Upper Great Lakes, and along the Pacific coast. How accurate is this? Well, this is something that we're going to be spending a lot of time looking at and trying to figure out just how much this map tells you. It misses a lot. You know, it misses the county level. That's something we'll go down and we'll look at. One thing that those who tell us that we are experiencing extreme polarization is to look at the county level and to look at the number of so-called landslide counties, counties where one candidate wins by more than 20%. Back in 1976, only some 27% of US counties were landslide counties. Last election, it was more like 48%. So we've seen a big jump. But remember this, compare that to Ukraine or Bolivia. That initial Ukraine map, actually, all of those counties or electoral districts except one were landslides. And really, as 20% is not that extreme. But it's much more extreme than it was, as I say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or 40 years ago. This map is one that, like I say, it's deeply penetrated public consciousness. It's interesting to see how it's portrayed. It's the object of a lot of parody. Yes, 1 fish, 2 fish, red state, blue state. I find it interesting that California is so much larger than Texas in that map. It may tell you something about a person who made it. We see all sorts of fun things on the internet. The RedBlue Quiz from Slate magazine. Take the quiz and find out are you a red stater or a blue stater. I just got a few of these. Jon Stewart, well, I pegged that pretty easily as a comedian. That makes me a blue stater. I must say, I didn't know the answer to this. Anyone know? What, nobody knows? I guess we're in a blue state. The answer is Dale Earnhardt. When he died in stock car racing, he was driving car number 3. But then I got really suspicious of this quiz when I came to number 4. Which are the Quad Cities? Anyone know the Quad Cities? Quad Cities are Rock Island, Moline, Davenport, and Bettendorf. This is on the upper Mississippi border between Iowa and Illinois. If you got that right, that means that you get 5 points, I believe, for being a red state person. Here's the problem with this. It's a solidly Democratic voting area. Rock Island County voted 57% for Kerry. This area, yeah, it's not a red area, it's a blue area. So maybe the people who made the quiz didn't perhaps know as much about so-called red America as they might have. Well, going a little more humorous or a little more offensive. Now, many people found this map offensive. It's all over the internet. This appeared after 2004. You can find this many places. I show it actually not for humor, but to illustrate a point, which is that at least in some people's view, this polarization was so extreme that they were questioning, at least for comedic purposes, the unity of the United States, throwing those blue voting states in with Canada and separating the other areas into a different place. We'll talk about the religious divide in a bit. One thing about this map, though, is people in Canada looked at it and said, wait a minute, you Americans don't know the geography of Canada. What did they miss? Well, no, not so much. Well, it's interesting. Quebec, very distinctive voting pattern. It votes for the Parti Québécois, but it's actually, Parti Québécois is fairly left. The province that they're missing is the Canadian province of Alberta, sometimes known as the Texas of Canada. It comes out in oil. It comes out in voting patterns, to be sure. So that's sort of the Canadian correction to that map. A few other things to note about this is, yes, I was going to use the term cartographic obliteration of the United States for that. Well, is this an accurate view? And again, we can go back and forth on it. As I said before, many people say no, not accurate at all. Not only is the American populace at large not very polarized, but actually the geographic structure of that voting pattern is not particularly polarized either. If you put it in a scale from 100% Democratic voting to 100% Republican, we get a purple America. Yeah, Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, they look pretty red. Massachusetts, Vermont look pretty blue, but just about everything else is fairly purple. A different take on the issue. And I'll be showing you a number of maps, both later today and through this course, that tries to show you the in-betweenness of a lot of these voting patterns that we can see. One thing else that I'm going to do is take you all the way back historically. Most of the course is going to focus on the recent period. 2000, 2004, and 2008 will occupy most of our time. We're also going to explore the history of this, beginning at the very beginning. This was what, the third election in the United States with John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson. And you can see in the Electoral College how geographically structured it was. New England, some of the middle Atlantic states versus the South, Pennsylvania, in the middle in that swing position. And we'll find there are many times in American history where we have had geographical polarization and then other periods where it disappears. And it sort of goes back and forth and new patterns emerge. Very interesting way to look at the issue. Why red and blue? Doesn't have to be. In fact, before 2000, it wasn't. It often wasn't. Different colors were used. Sometimes blue was used for Republicans and red for Democrats, as in this map of 1984. And I should mention this comes from a wonderful internet source, Dave Leap's Atlas of U.S. Presidential Elections. It's on the syllabus. I would highly recommend that you spend some time with it. You can even join and get some extra goodies out of the site. But a wonderful array of maps that Dave Leap has put together. He started this before 2000, and he mapped it with the Republicans as blue as the Democrats as red. People write in all the time saying, it's confusing, change it. He said, well, I started doing this a long time ago. Why should I go back and change all of my maps? Well, for your benefit, when I have used his maps, I have made the change. So otherwise, it would be, I think, a bit confusing. But actually, in this very election, 1984, Reagan versus Mondale. David Brinkley on the Nightly News described the United States, the map of the United States, as a sea of blue. And by that, he meant Republican voting pattern. And you can certainly see at the county level, oh, yes, indeed, a sea of blue. Even in the Bay Area, you see as much blue as red there. And actually, there were some people on the conservative side of the political spectrum don't like the fact that we now associate the Republicans with red and the Democrats with blue. The argument being that red is the color of socialism. Shouldn't we put it the other way around? There have been arguments, but by and large, the conservatives have made peace with it. And actually, you can find interesting blogs like Red State blog and a whole number of different sites that embrace the term red state. When we look at maps of Canada, though, however, we're finding still the convention is to put the conservatives with blue. You can see how conservative Alberta is, and the liberals in various shades of red, pink if they're not quite so strongly voting. And here we have the Parti Québécois in a sort of a blue-green color. So Canada a little more complicated as far as its party structure goes. Well, let me go back to the map here. Talk about the ideas behind it. What are the patterns that this map is supposedly showing? Let's just take the map for a while as a given. Let's just say, OK, we can accept that there are red states and blue states. Now, later on, I'll try to sort of dismantle that idea and show it's much more complicated. But let's just take the stereotype as it exists. And let's ask, well, what differentiates the red states and the blue states other than voting? Are there consistent features that separate this one block of the United States from another block? Well, certainly, as that map I showed you earlier of the United States of Canada versus Jesus Land would indicate, religious attendance at the national scale is probably the best predictor of voting patterns. So those individuals who attend religious services more than weekly, and they form 16% of the electorate, voted 65% for George Bush. Those attending weekly, 60%, that's 27% of the electorate. A few times a month, pretty much divided, 51% voting for George Bush, and that's 14%. Several times a year, now we have a strong carry lead, 42% voting for George Bush, and those who never attend religious service, 37% voting for Bush. So this is one of the best predictors of voting behavior. Of course, you can see that there would be plenty of people who attend more than once a week who voted the other way, and the same over here, that it's not a total divide. We're not talking about 80, 90%, but we are talking about pretty significant divisions. And we can see this in other data that we can look at. And here's a map at the level of the state. If you look at it at states, it works, but not nearly as well as you might expect. So we have the least religious states, and I should say, too, it's really hard to get this information. Sociologists of religion know that people aren't always completely honest about how often they attend religious service. They will tend to overestimate it. And so there are lots of techniques for trying to get a better handle on it. And actually, you get quite varying maps. They vary quite a bit from one survey to another. But let's just take this map as given, showing the least religious areas of the country, the Pacific Coast, New England, and New York, basically. Two pretty solid blocks. Note, however, that Nevada, which has one of the lower attendance rates of church, is not a blue state, but a purple state, a swing state. It went for George Bush in the most recent election. It's tending for Barack Obama right now, but it certainly would be classified by just about anyone as a purple state. We have a few other oddities. We find that the Intermontane West tends to not be very religious, except Utah and Idaho. This would be the Mormon cultural bloc, which has very high rates of religious attendance. But Wyoming, which is a very heavily Republican voting state, actually fairly low rates of church attendance. And we find in part of the upper Great Lakes, states like Minnesota, which actually has been the most reliably Democratic voting state over the last 50 years. It hasn't gone Republican since 1972. It has actually much higher rates of religious attendance than many other states. Also, you can see fairly high in Pennsylvania. So yeah, the basic pattern, a religious South, parts of the Great Plains, Utah, heavily Republican voting, and a more secular Northeast and West Coast. So the pattern holds, but not perfectly as we look at this. What are some of the other factors that are often associated with red states versus blue states? One would be, well, another one, well, it's not a great map. Again, I put it in there because I knew people would laugh at it. This is the map of Starbucks per capita and Walmart's per capita. It's very common on the internet. It's been commented on various points. But actually, it doesn't work that well if you look at it. What this map is really showing, as much as anything else, is what its geographers would call diffusional patterns. Starbucks started in the Northwest and diffused outwards. So we can see a lot of coverage in states like Arizona. Arizona hasn't gone for, well, it went for Clinton in '96. Other than that, it hasn't gone for a Democratic candidate since '64. Well, another thing, too, is that a lot of Western cowboy culture, they are into coffee. That is something you'll notice very, very clearly. So that has something to do with it. Walmart, having started in Arkansas, diffusing outwards. It's interesting that New Hampshire, a very independent purple state, shows up there as well. What I was trying to show here is the blue states, the democratic states, are generally associated with cosmopolitanism. I can't find any map that shows that. I don't know, how would you measure that? How would you map it? I spent a long time trying to find maps. This was the best I could do. Not very good. What about education? Well, this shows, again, at the national level, it looks like education is very clearly correlated with Democratic voting. So this is the percent of the vote for Kerry in 2004. Those who did not graduate from college, had some college or less, 47% voting for Kerry. College degree or more, evenly split, and postgraduate degree, 55% voting for Kerry. This sort of thing makes it seem like it's pretty clear. You know, a substantial number of postgraduates, people with postgraduate degrees voting for Bush, yes, but we still see this tendency. Other ways of looking at it show us the same sort of thing. What I've done here is taken the most educated states as measured in percent of people who have a bachelor's degree or higher. So starting with Massachusetts with 37% of the population. These would be the highest states over here, from the highest, from the top down through the top 6. And West Virginia, this would be the lowest, 15%, with the bottom 6 states over here. So we can see then the percent voting for Bush. Low except Colorado, another purple state right now trending in the Democratic direction, but which voted pretty clearly for Bush 4 years ago. New Hampshire, right in the middle as far as voting goes. But Maryland, New Jersey, Connecticut, very clearly voting for John Kerry. On the other side, it's even, the pattern is more definite. All of the states with low levels of education, as measured in this way, voted pretty heavily for George Bush. Many of them, 60% or over. So you can see Alabama, that was one of the strongest Republican voting states that we had. What's interesting is if we measure it in different ways, we find different patterns. What if we just look at, look at states where the vast majority of people have graduated from high school? Not talking about people with higher levels of education, but just looking at those where just about everyone has a high school degree, not many high school dropouts or people who haven't attended high school. And by this measure, Minnesota is the most educated state, which voted for Kerry, but not by a huge margin. Then we go to Montana, Wyoming, one of the most Republican voting states, 29% for Kerry. Nebraska, Utah, very heavily Republican voting states. And again, New Hampshire coming in. So for the states where everyone is educated to the high school level, or just about everyone, it's a mixed bag. And actually, a lot of these states are heavily Republican voting. States where you have a lot of people who have not completed high school, with Texas being at the bottom, all except when we get to Rhode Island, which I was actually very surprised to see, voting for the Republican Party. What's interesting, actually, you don't have to go many more steps down to find California as a high percentage of people who have not completed a high school, as well as a high percentage of people who have advanced degrees. California, a very bifurcated state on income, on education, on other sorts of issues. These maps aren't particularly good, but it's showing county-level data, showing percentage of population without a high school degree. So the white counties are ones where virtually everybody has a high school degree or better. The dark red areas, substantial percentage of people who don't. And you can see a very clear pattern, with some exceptions. The exceptions here are generally American Indian reservations. I'll talk about those later. But we can see this area in the north central part of the country, some Democratic voting states like Minnesota, some Republican states like Nebraska or Kansas. So it's a regional pattern. It doesn't correlate that well with voting patterns. New England, fairly well educated. Or the opposite map here, just percentage of population with a bachelor's degree or higher. Again, we can see a somewhat similar pattern. Actually, high levels of education from Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, as well as the Plains states, much lower in the South, and actually fairly low in a good part of the Midwest. So at this level, the educational pattern doesn't fit quite so well. What else? Well, how about income? We started talking about income, so let me continue with that. And here's where it gets really interesting because of the paradoxes we'll see in a second. If we just take household income, 2006, median household income, the green states here, the wealthier states, the yellow states, the poorer states, and we see good but imperfect correlation with our red-blue voting pattern. We see the wealthiest part of the country from New Hampshire and Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, Maryland. A very clear pattern here, and that's a very strongly Democratic voting area. We see the upper Great Lakes, some relatively wealthy states like Illinois and Minnesota. We see in the Pacific Coast some relatively well-off states like California and Washington. But then we also have some exceptional patterns. Well, we find Utah, which is one of the wealthier states, and one of the most Republican voting states. By some measures, the most Republican voting state. One thing that's interesting, though, this is household income. It comes out differently if you do per capita. Utah would be much lower in per capita because Utah has large families and a high fertility rate. So what you choose to map can lead to very, very different patterns. Well, what do we see here? How good is the correlation? We can see a relatively poor area in the northern plains, North Dakota and South Dakota and Montana. Yes, Republican voting. A poor area across most of the South, with Virginia being quite an exception, Georgia and Florida and Texas exceptional as well. And that correlates fairly closely, but again, imperfectly. Arizona, another Republican voting state, relatively well off as well. We can look at some other ways of doing this. Take the wealthiest states in the country by, again, median household income. Look at the percentage of people voting for Kerry, and what do we see? Well, New Jersey, 53%, Maryland, 56%, Hawaii, 54%, Connecticut, 54%, and so on. We don't really get an exception until we hit Alaska, which has it's a relatively wealthy state, although also a very expensive state to live in, with a very Republican voting pattern. And then Utah, we hit it again with an even more Republican voting pattern. Virginia, 45%, although as we'll talk about later, Virginia now is trending Democratic by about the same margin. So there can be a shift. I don't know about you, when I saw this, I was surprised to see California came in as low as it did. Does that surprise anyone? Here's the answer. States with high and low income inequality. The darker the state, the higher the income inequality, and California is off the charts there. Spend some time in the Central Valley. Go to Kern County or Tulare County, many other states in the Central Valley, and you're going to find a lot of poverty. And you have actually for a long time. Some geographers will tell you that's actually comes from the nature of California agriculture, where you have a very high demand for seasonal labor and low demand for year-round labor. This is something we can talk about the Okies coming in the Dust Bowl. We can talk about Mexican migrants now. But it's a situation where there's a lot of employment for a short period of time, and that is generally correlated with high levels of poverty that comes from that agricultural economy. One thing that's interesting is you can't correlate this with that RedBlue map at all. You know, look, we have a swath in the Southwest from Texas being also the second most unequal distributed wealth pattern in the country, heavily Republican voting. We can see states that have low income inequality, like Iowa, a classic purple state, but also red states like Wyoming in that same category. So this is really hard to correlate. What this map would correlate well with would be Hispanic population. Actually, there's a pretty good fit to that map right now. So North Carolina with a large Hispanic population, and states like Iowa with a very low. So a lot of this reflects somewhat recent immigration. What if we look at the lower end of the income spectrum? So this is by median household income, percent voting for George Bush in 2004. So we have from the poorest state, second poorest, third poorest, and so on. So we can see Mississippi at the poorest state. One thing that's about half the median household income that we had in the wealthy states that we saw before, states like Maryland, Connecticut, and so on. That's a bit of an exaggeration because it's a lot cheaper to live in Mississippi. So if we were actually to take it in purchasing power parity, a wealthy state like Maryland has about 1.5 times the average income than a poor state like Mississippi. By global standards, that's not huge by any means. That's substantial, though. And we certainly do find the poorer states heavily voting for the Republican Party, 59% for George Bush here in Mississippi, 62%, we saw this before, in Alabama. New Mexico, which was a razor-edge election in 2004, Bush barely winning, is the one poor state here that's in the purple category. The rest are for presidential elections in the red category. We can see the same thing in California at the county level. Now, this is per capita rather than household income. Sorry that I couldn't get the same measurement, but this was the data that I was able to easily find. So we can see Marin County, $45,000 per person per year. The richest county, 73% voting for John Kerry. San Francisco, 83%. That's one of the highest in the country. San Mateo, Santa Clara, close to home. Pretty clear margin of victory by Kerry. Then Contra Costa County, 62%. One Southern California county on this list, and it's the one that voted for George Bush. And California does have a pretty clear north-south divide, which I'll talk about later on. Here are the poor counties. Imperial in the far southeast, the poorest, and it voted for voted for Kerry, but all the other poor counties, these are San Joaquin Valley, Sacramento Valley, San Joaquin Valley, and the very far northwest, all voting quite clearly for George Bush. So again, a good correlation here between the wealthier areas voting for the Democratic candidate and the poor areas for the Republican. So just to give you an idea of where these counties are, if you don't know it, Tulare County here, Imperial down there. What do we have? Merced County, and we had Glenn County and Yuba County, Del Norte County over there. Here would be Ventura County, and then our Bay Area counties. It's paradoxical, though. Oh, it's paradoxical for a couple reasons. One is, if we look at a quintessentially red state and a relatively poor state, what do we see? We see the exact opposite pattern at the county level. And Alabama shows it to a T. we see we're back to median household income, percent voting for Bush. So the wealthiest county in Alabama, which counts as one of the country's top 100 at least wealthy counties. I'm not sure if it makes it in the top 50. 80% voting for George Bush. Madison County, actually, this is a little more purple than most of the other counties. This is Huntsville, big NASA installation, a large number of engineers, one of the largest in the country. So it's a little bit closer, but it's still voting for Bush. This is a wealthy suburb of Birmingham. This is a relatively well-to-do area on the Gulf Coast. This is Birmingham itself. Actually, when we get to Montgomery, it's the only relatively wealthy Alabama county that voted for Kerry. It's also more than 50% African American. And there's real close correlation here, and I'll show you maps later on between race, income, and voting, with the white population in Alabama being overwhelmingly Republican. So actually, it's, income comes in here, but racially has more to do with it. Here's the poorest counties of Alabama, and you can see how poor they can be, $17,000 for household income, 32% for Bush, 29%, and so on. All of these poor counties are all substantially African-American majority counties. The pattern, though, is the opposite from the red states to the blue states, with California and Alabama, I think, forming the sort of two extremes. Which leads then to the big paradox. Rich places vote for the Democratic Party. Rich people vote for the Republican Party. How do we deal with this? Income and voting for the Bush vote. Again, household income over $200,000, 62% for Bush. Over $50,000, 57%. Under $50,000, 45%. Under $15,000, 36%. This is a real central paradox. And really, to understand this, you really get some insight into how the American electorate is geographically structured. And if you want an excellent overview of this, you can read a recently written book called Red State, Blue State, Rich State, Poor State, Andrew Gelman, Why Americans Vote the Way They Do. And he has a lot of interesting things to say, analyzing a tremendous amount of data. And what he would argue is that the poor people across the country vote pretty similarly, and they vote for the Democratic Party in general. In the red states, more strongly so, but it's a cross-country pattern. We don't see it as much in California, perhaps as some other states, but it is throughout the US. Middle class and wealthier people, a completely different story. In the Republican voting states, the middle class and especially the upper class, strongly Republican voting. In the blue states, the middle class, pretty clearly Democratic voting, and the upper class, if you will, split. So he argues that this red-blue divide is something that happens among the affluent. That's where the real difference is. And he further argues that you can see this not just in voting, but in many other aspects of life. In a state like Alabama, affluent people far more likely to attend church than poor people. In a state like California, the opposite. Alabama, affluent people far more likely to be culturally conservative. In California, affluent people far more likely to be culturally liberal. So his argument really is one about the affluent half of the population or third of the population, however you want to peg that, which has very different voting patterns and social attitudes from one part of the country to another. Gelman argues that in any county, the wealthier people are going to be more Republican voting. He has one line that says that. I'd like to test that out. I mean, is it true that in San Francisco, would it be the wealthier San Franciscans who are voting Republican? What do you think? I see people shaking their head. How about in Palo Alto? You think it's going to be the richest Palo Altoans who are voting Republican? Okay, I see some people I don't know. What I'd like to do, if I ever had time, would be to go into the precinct data, look at how Los Altos Hills, Hillsborough, Woodside are voting, compare those to Redwood City or other places. I haven't done that. I haven't seen anyone else who's done that either. It's really easy to get this county level data. That's no problem. If you want to go down to the precinct level, it's harder. Yes? Okay, the comment was that that Hillsborough and Atherton, very wealthy areas, voter registration, much more Republican. That fits Gelman's model perfectly. That's exactly what he would argue. So that he would say, yes, that's the pattern. And we see it here in Northern California as well as everywhere else. So it's kind of an interesting way of looking at this. Again, if anyone has views on this subject, I'd love to hear them because it's something that's a real interesting aspect. Yes?
What about transplants, too?
Transplants, yes. Well, that's something I'll be talking about in a few weeks. As people move from one area to another, a lot of opinion polling would suggest that conservative people are actually more likely to move from one area to another. We will see later on that the fastest growing counties are all Republican voting counties in the country, fastest growing in percentile term, and that has to do with transplants. There's a very interesting argument by a guy named Bill Bishop. He calls it the great sort. The Americans are sorting themselves out by wanting to move to areas to some extent where they feel comfortable, and that can include politically comfortable as well. So he'd argue we're going to see a lot more of this kind of polarization as we go on. Yes, in general, yes, the question, are wealthy people more likely to vote? Yes, that's a very definite trend. Although there are also a lot of voter registration drives to try to even that out. But there's pretty good correlation with that factor as well. Okay, well, thank you for your input. I really do appreciate it. I think I may have done enough here on this issue. Let me move on then and talk about the map again. Go back to the map. Go back to this great red and blue map again, accepting that as true, but then maybe not. A map all maps conceal, right? There's a very interesting book by a geographer named Marc Monmonier called How to Lie with Maps. One of his arguments is, we're always, in a way, lying with maps because maps are showing some things, but they're leaving a lot out. And depending on the categories you choose, you can show some very different things. And both Democratic and Republican partisans would tend to say that this map is pretty misleading. If you just look at that, well, let's start from the perspective of a partisan from the Democratic Party. I'd say, you look at that map, and the United States looks Republican. But we know it's split. We know it's very evenly split, at least in this election. Well, why not do a cartogram? A cartogram is a map where you change the size of different areas on the basis of some other variable, in this case, population. So you simply deform the map to make populous states, like California, much larger than sparsely populated states like Montana. This is put together by a team of physicists at the University of Michigan. I believe they're all physicists, Mark Newman, Michael Gassner, and Cosma Shalizi. Visit their website. It is wonderful. It's short. They don't have a lot, but what they do is amazing. You'll see their other maps later on to do these mathematical transformations. So you do that mathematical transformation, and what do you see? You see a pretty evenly divided country in terms of population, as we know happened from the voting patterns. Yes?
What's the name of that site?
It's on that syllabus. So the back side of the syllabus has important information on websites, and I think I actually have the URL there. So you can check that out. Republican partisans will often say that map of red and blue is misleading, that it's exaggerating the Democratic voting areas, because even when you go into blue states, you'll find that vast areas of those blue states are solidly Republican voting. So here's California in 2004. Unfortunately, the color distinctions have washed out a little bit, but in the original, if you go to Dave Leap's atlas, you can see that these counties in the Bay Area very clearly Democratic voting. Compare that to the Central Valley, San Joaquin Valley. Actually, when you get up to Modoc and Lassen County, you're well over 70% Republican voting. Southern California, Los Angeles County, Santa Barbara County, went for Cary, but other counties, certainly Orange County and San Diego and Riverside and San Bernardino and Ventura, San Luis Obispo as well, went Republican. So there are vast swaths of California that are heavily Republican in their voting pattern. And if you spend any time in the San Joaquin Valley, you'll figure this out pretty quickly. Bakersfield is really part of the South Central United States culturally, in terms of music, even accent to some degree, church-going, any way you want to look at it. Kern County especially doesn't fit in the rest of California. It's a different... that is Mono County and Alpine County, very sparse population. This is Bishop. No, Bishop is in Inyo, right? Big Pine. Anyway, it's a place that's small population, and a lot of people have moved there from places like the Bay Area for its natural amenities. So it used to have very different voting patterns, but it's changed because of that. And when you get a real small population, you don't have to have a huge influx of people to really switch it over.
Can you repeat that question?
Yes, the question is, what are you have blue counties, Democratic voting counties here along the Nevada border, and it would be Mono County and Alpine County with transplants from the Bay Area would be the biggest reason for that. California, if you think it's extreme, take a look at Pennsylvania. James Carville, Democratic strategist, had an interesting observation of Pennsylvania. Maybe you've heard it. If you're from Pennsylvania, maybe you'll be offended, but his line was, yeah, Pennsylvania. You have Philadelphia on one side, Pittsburgh on the other, and Alabama in the middle. Not entirely, but in voting patterns, oh, you bet. Many of these counties in central Pennsylvania, extremely Republican voting. So we have very much a divided state. And California and Pennsylvania are by no means the only one. Oregon, Washington, very big gaps. New York as well. The only part of the country where you'll see most counties voting for the Democratic Party would be New England. Elsewhere, Hawaii too. Elsewhere, most counties are going to be voting for the Republican Party. Yes?
But aren't you really just pointing out population density?
Absolutely. So what do we do? So the question is, aren't you just pointing out population density? So then what we need to do is show maps that take that into account. And I have some in store. So they'll be coming soon. Another thing that Republican partisans might want to say is, OK, let's take the whole country and look at the county level patterns and look at the vote. What do we see? We see a red country with blue splotches. We see some blue splotches in the center. And it's interesting, these blue areas of the South, and I don't have the map now, but I'll show it to you later on, correlates almost exactly with racial patterns, heavily African-American counties along the Mississippi and what's known as the Black Belt of Alabama and parts of Tidewater, Virginia as well. By and large, though, you look at that map and what do you see? You see a lot of red and not that much blue. If we map it a little more carefully to show percentages, and I'm very sorry that the colors wash out. If you go to Dave Leap's atlas, you can see the color differential very clearly. On this, it doesn't show up. Garfield County, Montana, over 90% Republican voting, but there are only 633 voters there, so it's not that many. There's only a few counties that come out at over 90%. But we see a very dark red swath from Texas through Oklahoma and Kansas, Nebraska, up into Montana, Wyoming. But these are sparsely populated areas, which is, of course, what the Democratic rejoinder would be. I'd say, OK, want to talk about counties? Let's make county cartograms. So we can see Los Angeles County with its 10 million people, Cook County with over 5 million. There's Long Island. A very different pattern indeed. And in this pattern, it looks pretty geographically balanced, doesn't it? We have many areas in the South. That would be Atlanta and some of Atlanta's suburbs, not all by any means. Big blue area here. I'll talk about some of these individual counties a bit later on. But you can see, OK, from Austin up to Kansas City, yeah, that's a pretty big solid red area. But by and large, the rest of the country pretty much has these divisions. Well, yes, very blue up here and over there as well. Well, what else can we do with it? Well, now we'll go back to, OK, another of these maps from the University of Michigan. Let's just go back to counties. But let's show purple America. Let's show purple counties. You can see on this map, a lot of the country shows up very purple, pretty evenly divided. A huge area from much of Minnesota and Wisconsin, virtually all of Iowa, down into northern Missouri. The Missouri Ozarks, again, we're going very strongly Republican. Then we get down to Arkansas. It's a very purple area. Parts of Louisiana, parts of Tennessee, West Virginia, parts of Ohio as well. Big swath in North Carolina. Even big areas in New England and upstate New York. Very clearly purple areas. Now, yes, there are some, oh, yes. Yeah, they would have a metric, and I don't know precisely the cutoff figures, but if it's probably within, if it's anywhere within 10% voting margin or so, I think they're labeling it purple. But yeah, you'd have to actually check out their website to see what their cutoff points are. The question is, yeah, how are they defining what gets categorized as purple versus what's going to stay blue or red? In this red zone, you can see some very blue counties, American Indian reservations in just about all cases. Later on, I'll show you maps of some of these states. Montana, you can see very clearly the Native American reservations, but we can also see other exceptional areas. Sometimes they're university towns, sometimes they're mining areas with high degrees of unionization. But it's a map where, yes, you do see some very red areas. Utah, very red. Again, you can see parts of central Pennsylvania, very red. Areas in the Gulf Coast. But what, oh, and I should say, too, that there are some scholars and journalists who say, yeah, look at this map, and it's purple patterns. They're not following state lines. Let's remap American political geography. Let's ignore the states and come up with systems like this. So here we have a very interesting new take of American political geography. I think it's quite admirable. I'm a bit suspicious of some of the patterns. Notice we have these discontinuous areas. And you can see that purple zone in the middle. They're finding it and differentiating and calling it the Big River, Mississippi zone from Arkansas up through Minnesota. Yeah, you look at Arkansas voting patterns and Minnesota patterns, they're pretty different. Yeah, there are a lot of Democrats in Arkansas, but they're Democrats of a certain variety. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And these El Norte, areas with lots of Hispanic population, that's a pretty gerrymandered district, right, in that sense. So I think it's an interesting attempt, but what I prefer is Gassner, Shalezy's, and Newman's Final Map, where they take the county cartograms and they put it in the red to blue color spectrum. That I just think this is a work of genius. It's beautiful, and you can spend an amazing amount of time puzzling it out. And what do you see? Well, you see there's a large part of the country which is purple splotches surrounded by red. Right? And what the purple splotches are cities. You can see Houston. You can see Dallas here. You can see Memphis and Nashville and Louisville. You can see Indianapolis. Oh, no, that's Louisville. That's Nashville. That's Memphis. Anyway, there's St. Louis, dark blue in the middle. Here's Columbus, Ohio. Here's Atlanta, the blacker areas of Atlanta, very Democratic voting. The whiter areas, purple in between. You can see New Orleans clearly. You can see Washington and Baltimore and Philadelphia and New York. What I find most interesting, though, is the circular patterns you find in many areas. Take a place like Dallas. So here's Dallas purple in the middle. Voted for George Bush, but not by much. But then you get into the outer suburbs of Dallas, the fast-growing new suburbs. There you find many counties 70 up to 80% Republican voting. And you can see this same pattern around Atlanta to some degree, even around cities like Indianapolis. Even some places you might not expect it. There's Milwaukee. It's on the blue side of purple, and so it's Democratic voting. Waukesha County, wealthy suburban county, very clearly Republican voting. And that really is where a lot of the battle has been in the suburban counties. We know that the rural areas tend to go Republican unless they're African American or Hispanic or American Indian. We know the cities are going to vote Democratic. It's the counties. And in the Northwest and the Pacific Coast, most of the suburbs vote for the Democratic Party. Southern California is different. A lot of these suburbs are heavily Republican voting, but from the San Francisco area up to Seattle, suburbs tend to be Democratic voting. In the South, the suburbs, the most Republican voting area. In the Midwest, it's in between. And again, we'll look at maps of individual counties and see how they've shifted over time. Counties like Oakland County, just north of Detroit, had been a Republican bulwark. It has recently shifted into the Democratic category. Wealthy suburban counties like Westchester, New York, very Republican voting, not anymore. So in some places, this shift has occurred. In other places, it hasn't. And it's a real interesting place to look and see where things may be going. So are there any questions on this map? Yes? This was made right after the 2004 election. So it shows, and thank you for bringing up the date of the map, so it shows the 2004 election. I hope these scholars will do the same thing with the 2008 election. Like I say, they're not geographers, and I don't know if they're getting any credit for what they're doing. I hope they are, because I'm sure it took a lot of time to crunch that data and create these maps. Yes? Yeah, the question is, how much does this have to do with demographic change as the large baby boom population gets older? That's an important factor, and maybe later on I'll show you some data showing different age groups and how they vote. Right now, younger people are tending to vote Democratic very heavily. People in their middle years, more Republican. Retired people tending to vote more Democratic. Some of that has to do, though, with concerns over issues like Social Security. But it's very geographically structured, and the same age cohort that would vote one way in one part of a country is going to vote a different way in a different part of the country. And that's always going to be my focus, is on how those geographic issues are structured. Certainly, I mean, we can see the Great Plains here, not very well, because not many people live there. This is a very heavily Republican voting area. It's a very old area. Many of these counties have some of the oldest populations in the country, and many of them are diminishing so much that they may be disappearing. There's a lot of counties in western Nebraska, Kansas, that have very small and rapidly. So actually, the Republicans, they get the fastest growing populations. They get the fastest shrinking populations as well. But it is in that red belt. Take a look at this. There's Salt Lake City. It's a bit purple, surrounded by very, very red area of Utah outside of the city. So that's another interesting pattern we can get to. Let's switch a little bit. Let's shift from the national level to the level of state voting. That beautiful purple splotchy map I just showed you really tells you a lot about voting patterns, but it doesn't tell you anything about the Electoral College, where the votes count. The way the party system works in this country, yes, there's a big emphasis on what states overall are going to go Democratic, what states are going to go Republican. But if we look away from the national presidential election, and if we just focus on individual states and how they're voting for their senators, their representatives in the House, their governors, we actually see very different patterns. So here we have purple states that have one Democratic and one Republican senator, blue states with 2 Democrats, and red states with 2 Republicans. And we find on this level, our map is very different than the maps we've seen before. Maybe some surprises. Montana and North Dakota, both with 2 Democratic senators. Arkansas as well. West Virginia as well. Or Maine with its 2 Republican senators. Maine very clearly voting for Democratic presidential candidates. And the same, well, New Hampshire is more of a swing state. That tells us different things about different places. One thing it tells us that what it means to be a Democrat is different often on the state scale than it is on the national scale. So a lot of Democrats from places like Montana wouldn't have a very good chance of winning the primaries in the Democratic Party because they tend to be too conservative, and the same with Republicans in these areas. But the two-party system tends to lead to a competitive political environment, and the different parties then adjust to local circumstances. So like I say, it's a pretty interesting map, and whoa, I jumped way ahead there. Senate. This is just showing a website, electoralvote.com, showing the Senate races now, how they are trending. So the gray states do not have a senatorial race. All the other states do. And just to show you that some changes are in store, New Mexico is almost certain to get another Democratic senator, as is Virginia. Here it is. Virginia has been one of the most consistently Republican voting states, hasn't gone for a Democratic presidential candidate since 1964, I believe. But it's going to look like it's going to have two Democrats in the Senate. May also pick up a seat in Minnesota, in Oregon, may happen in New Hampshire as well, Kentucky, Georgia, and I was surprised to see Mississippi tending Republican, but not by a huge margin. Colorado may be another pickup for the Democratic Party. So this map will be changing. It will become more blue in that sense. But what I find interesting is areas where this map doesn't fit the other map. Yes, question?
What does the color of Texas indicate?
That would indicate that Texas is likely to re-elect a Republican, but not by as large of a lead. Yes, the question is, why is Texas in this sort of pinkish color? So it's very clear that in Oklahoma, the Republican candidate is going to win, no doubt about it. Texas, most likely, but not quite as sort of sewn up. So you'd have a scale going from red to pink to outlined pink, and from blue to light blue to outlined blue, just showing you the likelihood. Thank you. I should have explained that when I threw up the slide to begin with. How about governors? The same thing. Wyoming, one of the most Republican voting states in the country, actually has an extremely popular Democratic governor, one of the highest approval rates. It's interesting. He's done sort of the same thing Sarah Palin has. He's taken money from the energy companies and put those into state coffers, and that's been very popular with the citizens. Montana has a very popular Democratic governor as well. Arizona has a Democratic governor. Kansas, Oklahoma, again, very Republican voting states for the presidential election. Not necessarily so when we get to this level. We have a Republican governor in Vermont. They're mostly, as far as I can tell, running on something of a tax-cutting platform, which can win votes just about everywhere. So again, this is showing it's a lot more complicated. Far south, yes, very Republican. If you go to the House, it's a different matter. Far south, lots of Democrats. Actually, a lot of these districts are heavily gerrymandered. Take a look at that district in North Carolina. Why is that there? That's there to have a safe African-American majority district linking together African-American areas of a number of different cities. This is something that Democrats and Republicans have often agreed upon because you can both get safe seats that way if you fix these districts in this way. Utah, one of the most Republican voting states, has one of its congressional representatives is a Democrat. Interesting districts include Salt Lake City and a whole bunch of rural Utah. When they redistrict him, at first he just had Salt Lake City. They gave him all these rural areas. A lot of people thought he would lose, but he managed to pull through. Just note, Los Angeles with its Democratic representatives, suburban Southern California, different story. You can see Minneapolis and St. Paul, and Democratic. Then you can see the suburban Republican ring, and then the Democratic outliers. So that's pretty interesting patterns there. But through most of the country, very mixed. let me talk a little bit about this northern belt here, which I've found very interesting. Places like Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota that vote very heavily for the Republicans, although actually there's one poll now that puts North Dakota as a draw right now. Barack Obama pulled out a few weeks ago, and there's no way I can win North Dakota. The most recent poll shows them neck and neck, which is kind of interesting. But generally, Republicans win at the national level, but yeah, we've got governors here, we've got Congress people, we've got state people. If we go back historically, we find that these northern, sort of north-central states were some of the most left-leaning states. Montana in 1912, this is a fascinating election. You had Taft as the incumbent, hand-picked successor to Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt did not like the conservative direction Taft was taking. He challenged him and the Republican, for the Republican nomination and lost, and then formed his own party, the Progressive Party or Bull Moose Party. Eugene Debs running as a socialist, then Woodrow Wilson as a Democrat. By today's standards, Taft very definitely conservative. All of the others are somewhat liberal and to some extent, and well, Debs quite far to the left. Wilson liberal in many regards, though he was an arch segregationist, and so he had his conservative aspects. Roosevelt liberal in some areas, but quite militaristic and imperialistic, so conservative in some ways. But you can see the Republican candidate winning less than a quarter of the vote in Montana. And so we can sort of see some of these old patterns that they seem to disappear at one level. If you look at presidential election, when you look at the state elections and congressional elections, you can see maybe some continuation of those patterns. Or even equally interesting, 1924, you had Calvin Coolidge and John Davis running against him, both very conservative. Democrats were not necessarily liberal at this time at all. They generally were not in favor of big business, but on issues like race, they were usually the more conservative party at this point. And Robert La Follette, who had been a Republican governor of Wisconsin, disgusted by both parties, bucked it, formed a new progressive party that wanted government ownership of railroads and electric utilities, outlawing child labor, stronger laws to help labor unions, more protect, very liberal pattern is what we see. He won Wisconsin, came very close to winning Minnesota and North Dakota, and did, the map, again, the colors fade out, but did very well in the West and Northwest. Did not do well at all in the South and much of the sort of eastern Midwest, if you will. So again, we can see some of these continuing patterns. But as a little sort of warning, just because Montana has 2 Democratic senators and a Democratic governor doesn't mean they're liberal Democrats. And here we have the term, the Blue Dog Conservative Democratic Caucus. I don't know, is that a familiar term, the Blue Dog Democrats? They have their own group in the House of Representatives. There's actually a pretty substantial group. Interesting where this term came from. Anyone know where the term Blue Dog Democrat comes from? It started with a Yellow Dog Democrat. The Yellow Dog Democrat was a Southerner back in the days when the South was a one-party region. And their line was, I'd vote for anyone, even a yellow dog, as long as he's a Democrat. So that's a Yellow Dog Democrat. Then the Blue Dog Democrats came about in the 1970s and said, these northern and western liberals, they're pushing the party into such a liberal direction it's enough to choke a yellow dog blue. So therefore, you have the Blue Dog. That's their unofficial mascot. Anyone want to guess what state has the largest number of Blue Dog Democrats in the House? California. There are 7 in California, so actually that's a pretty substantial group. So in general, Blue Dog Democrats tend to be very opposed to Republican efforts to deregulate, opposed to Republican efforts to reduce taxes, especially on the more affluent. They're suspicious of big business having too much power. They tend to be centrist on hot-button issues like abortion. Some of them actually quite pro-life. Well, I don't know if anyone see the Bill Maher movie, Religulous. You saw an interview with a Democratic senator from Arkansas. Is it Mark Pryor, I believe? In religious terms, very conservative. But yet in other areas, much more centrist or even liberal on some of these economic issues. In places like Montana, a big hot button issue would be guns. Blue dog Democrats from western states tend to be quite pro-gun, not surprising. So these are people who are not going to win primaries at the national level, but at the state level, they can certainly do well. And contrasting to the blue dog Democrats are the Main Street Republicans, another sort of informal organization, and this is in the Senate, so you can see that Susan Collins and Olympia Snow from Maine, a state that's voted very heavily, well, relatively heavily for the Democrats at the presidential level, 2 women senators, both moderate Republicans, Main Street Republicans. These are people that the more conservative Republicans refer to as rhinos. You heard that, Republican in name only. And so they have a lot of trouble with their own party. I wonder what John McCain's standings is going to be with this group after, well, depends on, of course, who wins the election. But he has diverged quite strongly from the Main Street Republican platform, if you will, or ideology over the last few weeks. But you can see Minnesota, there's going to be, that's a tight race here in Minnesota. Al Franken, comedian, against Norm Coleman. But generally, we have more northern areas, with Arizona being a bit of an exception. So anyway, that I think is enough for now on this issue of state elections. But let me just pause and see if anyone has any questions or comments. Anything you want to explore? Next topic then I'd like to go into is examining, again at the national level, and here we have the Electoral College. We have how many electors come out of each state, and we have the 2004 red-blue map, or in this case, sort of a orangish, brownish versus blue map. This is a Wikipedia map. Wikipedia has a lot of pretty good maps on this. So here's this same map we've been looking at all along. One interesting thing to look at is not, well, we've looked at it geographically. Let's look at it historically. How long has this pattern been around? Is it very deep historically? No, not at all. It really. The most recent election before 2004, the 2000 election was quite similar. We go earlier than that, we don't see the same pattern at all. And in fact, a lot of the patterns we see today that seem so stark didn't exist 20 years ago. The 1988 election, George Bush Sr., Michael Dukakis, religious differences played almost no role in that election, maybe a few percent. And it really started in the 90s, the difference between the more religious and more secular voters and areas, and seems to be intensified. But we're not talking about a very deep pattern. And I'll just show you a few historical maps. We'll be spending a lot of time. You can switch back and forth between these, and we can see some changes. So we can see Iowa going from Democratic to Republican. Same with New Mexico. These are states right on the edge. We can see New Hampshire doing the opposite. You can also, as you flip back and through these, look at the electoral votes. Look at Florida and Texas. Look at Michigan and, say, Pennsylvania. Well, actually, oh, here I wanted. So 17, 18, oh, they lost 1. Pennsylvania, 21, 23, they lost 2. So the Electoral College changes as population changes, and it has been the more Republican voting areas that have been gaining electoral seats, and a lot of these Democratic states in the Northeast losing them. That's something, of course, Republican partisans are very happy about, and Democratic partisans are worried about. So we can see this is pretty much the same map. New Mexico sort of is a bit out of the pattern, but as I said before, New Mexico very much a swing state. But what if we go back to Clinton's second election against Dole? We don't see the same pattern here at all, do we? We see a real swath in the middle of the country from Louisiana and Arkansas, including Tennessee, Kentucky, voting for the Democratic candidate. Now, of course, the Democratic candidate for the presidency and the vice presidency were both Southerners. And that is something that a lot of Democratic Party strategists will say is important, maybe even necessary. To win, you got to have a Southerner who has a sort of reputation as a somewhat moderate individual. And it certainly worked to Bill Clinton's advantage. So you can see Clinton losing the Southeast, but winning in a lot of the sort of South Central area, winning the very important state of Florida. You can see Indiana being a bit of an exception in the Midwest. And you can see a larger Pacific Democratic voting area, including Arizona, a state that doesn't go Democratic very often. Go back a little bit more, back 20 years to 1988, George Bush Sr. against Michael Dukakis. And what do we find here? Well, we find a lot of states that we now think of as solidly blue, solidly Democratic voting, like Vermont or Connecticut, New Jersey, Maryland, California, then voting Republican. So there has been a real change. We'll see this later on. We'll look at California county maps. By 1988, the Bay Area was mostly voting for the Democrats, to be sure. But we go back another 10 years earlier, we'll find places like Marin County, San Mateo County voting for the Republican candidate. And actually, at the same time, we would find counties like Kern County voting for the Democratic. There's been a reversal in California, really interesting one. And that's something we can talk about. How much does that have to do with these areas changing their populations, and how much to do with the political parties changing their orientations? So anyway, you can see, obviously, a year that wasn't very good for the Democrats. Back to when Jimmy Carter won against Ford. It's an east-west split almost, right? With the Democrats, Carter, another Southerner from Georgia, taking the Southeast, except Virginia, very clearly, with Ford taking the West almost entirely. And then the Northeast, the upper Great Lakes split, at least at the state level. It's a little bit more complicated when we look at counties. That wasn't that long. I guess I'm old enough that it doesn't seem like that long ago to me, but we see a very different geography. And I have to ask if anybody knows why you have a vote for Ronald Reagan coming from Washington. Ever heard of a faithless elector? About half of the states have laws that the electors have to vote the way the states vote, but the other half don't. The electors can vote for whoever they want, basically. And so we had an elector from Washington who really liked Ronald Reagan and voted for him regardless. If you're interested you can go to Wikipedia and see the states that require them to vote as the state does, but not all of them by any means. Finally, my last historical map, because I'll be showing these as we go over the course, from 1896, William McKinley against William Jennings Bryan. The pattern is pretty much the opposite of what we have today, with a few exceptions, with Washington having been voting for the Democratic Party then and now, Kentucky voting for the Republican Party then and now, and Indiana then and now, North Dakota perhaps, but otherwise it's pretty much the inverse. And again, the question is, have the areas changed, have the parties changed, or is it a bit of both? Well, in this election, William Jennings Bryan was in favor of the common people, the poor people, particularly farmers and miners. He ran on a platform of inflation. He wanted coinage in silver. His big issue was the gold standard. He claimed that the American workers and farmers were being crucified on a cross of gold. They were deeply indebted. There was a shortage of gold, which meant it was a deflationary environment, and farmers who were deeply indebted couldn't make their payments. So it was an election all about monetary policy, which is interesting considering some of the issues we're facing today. McKinley was the candidate of the gold standard, of hard money, of fiscal conservatism. So then, yeah, it seems right. Republicans, more business-oriented, Democrats on the opposite side. When you look at the religious issue, it's the opposite. William Jennings Bryan, anyone know what else he was famous for besides running for president 3 times? The Scopes trial, the so-called monkey trial in Tennessee in the 1920s, when a teacher was tried for teaching evolution, and Clarence Darrow defended the teacher, and William Jennings Bryan was the prosecuting attorney trying to get him convicted for that. So this was a time when the Democratic Party was the party of religious fundamentalism, and the Republican Party wasn't. So interesting shifts and turns, more in the nature of the parties in a way than in the nature of the regions. One thing we'll find, Minnesota and South Carolina almost always vote for different parties. Only when it's a blowout election, like 72 when Nixon destroyed McGovern, or 36 when FDR destroyed Alf Lennon. Those are about the only times those two states ever vote the same way. Is there a question in the back? Yeah, question is with this election, anti-Darwinian sentiment in the South, yeah, and in parts of the Midwest as well. Undoubtedly it did, but in a way that was a somewhat later issue. It wasn't such a burning issue at the time. That came more in the 1910s and 20s. That was sort of a more front edge issue then. At this point, it was really about monetary policy above all. I mean, of course, other issues were involved. It's interesting, silver mining states like Montana and Idaho, Colorado, loved Bryan because his policy was coinage in silver, which would have really helped the silver mines. So that little bit sort of added fillip to his vote. We'll talk about all these in great length as we go through in the course. Like I say, we'll focus on the current period, but we're going to explore these earlier periods as well. I only have a few more maps because I do want to open it up to more general discussion, but let's look at where things are trending right now. We will end the class with this election, the election of 2008, and I'm really hoping we can get good county level maps and really give a fine scale analysis to that. By that time, we'll be used to looking at different counties and the county patterns. And of course, we'll be looking at the state patterns as well. This is from a few days ago. It's interesting. Why are Nebraska and Maine have little squares in them? Does anybody know? Yeah, they're the only states that split their electoral votes. And there are 5 electoral votes from Nebraska. 2 are sort of associated with the senators, and whoever wins Nebraska wins those 2 votes. And the other 3 have to do with the congressional districts, and whoever wins the congressional districts wins those. And so you can see the far eastern part of Nebraska, a possibility of an Obama electoral vote pickup there. How does this map compare to the ones that we were looking at for 2000 and 2004? Well, we see the same patterns, but with some interesting differences. We still see the same strongly Republican zone in the southeast. In the Plain states, but not North Dakota and Montana. Remember, they're a little different. And like I say, there's, as of today, there is a poll showing North Dakota split, 50-50 right now. Very interesting. It's been a long time. Again, I think it's 1964. It's the last time North Dakota voted for a Democratic presidential candidate. They like them on the state level, not at the presidential level. That will be interesting to see. New Mexico pretty clearly in the Democratic camp. Colorado trending that way. Nevada looks like it may be trending that way as well. The biggest change has to do with the far east. Here is Virginia, which has been, like I say, one of the most consistently Republican voting states for a long time. And now it is trending pretty clearly, both, especially for the senatorial election, but also for the presidential election. Virginia's changed, especially the growth of suburban Washington, D.C. Big population concentration now. And in electoral terms, that area is part of the Mid-Atlantic now. It's not part of the South. Indiana, very reliably Republican voting state. Most polls show it's still leaning McCain, but not by much. Missouri used to be a bellwether state. It used to be, they say, who wins Missouri wins the election. Missouri's part southern, part Midwestern, St. Louis suburbs, practically eastern in its voting patterns anyway. So it's pretty much neck and neck as well. Florida trending for Obama. And a lot of surprise for a lot of people to see North Carolina now trending in the Democratic direction as well. And that has to do with their senatorial race as well as the presidential race. It's just a few others. Virginia and West Virginia. When this was made, West Virginia was still, as of a few days ago, trending McCain, but just barely. It's narrowed way down, and some of the polls now show Obama ahead. This is a historic, if this were to happen, let's say if this map were to play out, and if Virginia voted for Obama and West Virginia voted for McCain, this would be a real historical reversal. It used to be that West Virginia was one of the most reliably Democratic voting states. Unionized coal miners, Democratic Party. If you remember that 88 map when Dukakis won so few states, he won West Virginia, and he won it pretty handily. Well, how do we explain this shift if it happens? Well, we can go back to Dave Leip's atlas and look at the primary, the Democratic primary, and look at the Clinton vote there in red and the Obama vote there in green. Obama, boy, did he strike out in West Virginia. He hardly got any votes at all. I mean, very low. Many of these counties, 10%, 15, maybe 20%. The mountain counties in Virginia, same story. But the eastern counties, whether they are the wealthy suburban counties like Loudoun County or poor African-American counties voting for Obama, these counties are almost all white, relatively poor. A lot of them are coal mining areas. Well, some are and some aren't. But it didn't matter here. It didn't matter if you're unionized. That didn't come into play. And so it looked for a long time like there was no way West Virginia would vote for Obama. But it's interesting to look at those trend lines. The trend lines have recently crossed, and Obama's now ahead slightly, at least by most polls I've looked at. So pretty interesting patterns looking at the Virginias. I just have two more. I have two maps from today. And it's interesting, from map to map, you'll see different patterns. So this map from today is showing West Virginia and Virginia both as weakly Democratic trending. It's showing North Dakota as strongly Republican trending. But then here's electoral vote, another polling operation showing North Dakota as weakly Democratic trending with the blue outline there. It's also showing West Virginia and Virginia both as moderately Democratic trending. And it's only showing Missouri as, boy, smack dab in the middle, no particular leader. Those are my maps, and that's my talk for today. We do have about 20 minutes for general discussion. I always like to have some time in the class, and we can just talk over these issues. One thing I find is in these classes, the audience knows an awful lot, and there's plenty of issues where the audience knows more than I do. So I'd like to hear from you. Yes? OK, the question is the fairness of the Electoral College system. Yes, indeed. OK, so it's obviously based on population, but if you multiply the population of North Dakota to get California, it's not 3 to 55. I mean, we have 38 million people here, and we have 620,000 over here. So it's the population disparity is much greater than the electoral vote disparity. 3 is the minimum. If you have 1 member of the House, 2 senators, you get 3 electoral votes. Well, that's the way it was established by the founders. There are certainly plenty of people who find it not entirely democratic, and there have been a lot of arguments made to get rid of it. One thing I should say, though, I'm going to try to avoid opining myself, giving my own opinions. And it's impossible to be totally neutral, right? I know no one can do it, but that's sort of my goal. So I guess I'm reluctant to, I'm going to be reluctant to say if I think it's a good idea or bad. If you want to talk in public, I'll tell you what I think. But I don't want to come down on one side or another. I want to talk about how Republicans see it, how Democrats see it, and sort of try to be neutral. But you certainly are right. There are very strong arguments against this, and that it favors states that vote Republican in general. Now we have Vermont, we have Delaware. They have 3. District of Columbia has 3. So there are some eastern Democratic voting areas that get a little bit of favor. But we have, Hawaii here with 4. But it's overall, it does help the Republicans. There's no doubt about that. Yes?
I know you don't want to opine, but the conventional wisdom that I've been taught is that if you win Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, and Illinois, you're in.
Yes.
Why, without going too far with that, why is that?
So the question is, the conventional wisdom is if you win a few swing states, Pennsylvania, 21 electoral votes. Ohio, 20. Florida, 27. These are states, yes, with a lot of electoral votes, very rich, and they tend to be right on that sort of razor's edge. And that then becomes the key. And it's been a long time since any candidate has tried to campaign in all 50 states. Richard Nixon tried it in 1960, and it didn't help him at all. And so the conventional wisdom is don't try to do this. Figure the states that you've got if you've got a real good chance of winning, you can sort of ignore it. Interesting. Minnesota, here, this has been the most Democratic voting state for the last half century, and it's shown as somewhat weak for Obama. McCain has outspent Obama, last I checked, 7-1. Now, that may have changed. Obama figured, well, Minnesota, I don't have to worry about that. McCain says, oh, there's some conservative areas in Minnesota. They've actually been trending a little bit more in the conservative direction. We may be able to take that. So generally, Obama's way outspent McCain, but not in Minnesota. So then, you get this focus of money spending and campaigning in these swing states. They got a lot of electoral votes, and they could go either way. Because a lot of states are fairly safe. Although right now, states that John McCain thought were safe, a lot of them, they don't appear so safe anymore. One thing that's interesting is back in the days before you had a strong primary system, when it was men in smoke-filled rooms who picked the candidates, they almost always picked candidates from swing states. Go back and look at elections. Well, we will. Late 1800s, early 1900s, they were all from New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Virtually all of them. Oh, New York and Ohio. Again and again, both parties doing this. The Democrats in that period never picked a Southerner. They knew they had the South. There's no point in picking a Southerner. You'd pick someone from New York because that was then a swing state. And the Republicans did the same thing. So it's interesting when you go into the period when the primaries are primary. You have Democrats nominating a couple candidates from Massachusetts. I mean, that never would have happened before because the party bosses would have said, poor electoral strategy. We don't want a Kerry or a Dukakis. They're not going to play that well in states like Missouri. Let's get somebody from a swing state. So I don't know, if anyone has other views on this, please jump in. I'd love to hear it. I know there were some hands up. Yes? Well, OK, the question was, we saw 1924 with Robert La Follette, a strong third-party bid. Now, there were other ones, and we'll see these. 1948, the Democrats split actually in three. The Dixiecrats split with Strom Thurmond after Harry Truman integrated the armed forces. And then there was Wallace, who had been a former vice president, who ran to the left of Truman, which was why everyone thought Truman was going to lose, why the newspapers printed up headlines, Dewey wins the election, Truman won. The Dixiecrats took a number of southern states. Wallace didn't play very well anywhere. But there were others. 92 would be a good case, and we'll see maps of that later on, when Ross Perot ran as a sort of maverick independent, took a lot of votes probably from both parties, maybe more from the Republicans, and that helped Bill Clinton run. And there were other minor ones. Ralph Nader winning in 2000 may have been the deciding factor. He didn't get that many votes, but in places like Florida, where the margin was razor thin, if those Nader voters would have voted for Gore, it would have gone the other way. John Anderson ran in 1980. That affected the election. So there have been a number of ones where third-party candidates have really affected. The only one who really had a chance of winning, I think, was Teddy Roosevelt in 1912 with his Progressive Party. Won California, won a lot of states. And so that was a possibility. The others, I don't think were ever real possibilities of winning. And I don't know if the candidates figured that or if they wanted to be spoilers. Who knows? I mean, I can't say that. Yes. OK, question is population density. How much does that have to do with it? It has a lot to do with it. I was going to save this for a little bit later in the class, but I could certainly talk about it now. That some scholars have said that is actually more important than religion in determining who votes where. So we can see a population density map here. We can see the national pattern here. There are some exceptions. There are some sparsely populated, highly Hispanic counties. in northern New Mexico that vote heavily for the Democrats. There's some sparsely populated black counties here, some sparsely populated American Indian counties. But other than that, yeah, it fits pretty closely. And I even have some state comparisons to show you. It's imperfect, but here's Ohio. And you can see these densely populated areas. Check them out. Here's Columbus. Here's Dayton. Cincinnati, an exception. Cincinnati is one of the largest metro areas that where the county tends to vote Republican. We'll see what happens this time. Washington, somewhat good correlation with the greater Seattle area. Spokane doesn't show up. So it works much better in New York. Works very well in New York. Doesn't work as well in Arkansas. In Arkansas, partly because race plays an important factor. A lot of rural African Americans who tend to vote Republican and live in some of these sparse counties. Although later on, I'll go into the counties that I really like are the real exceptions. There are some of these counties up here are poor, rural, mostly white, heavily Pentecostal and Southern Baptist, and continue to vote for Democratic presidential candidates. There's some little clusters. Tennessee has a few of these little clusters. I find that very interesting. Counties that I can't explain. But you're absolutely right. Yes, population density, a real crucial factor. Now, I know that there's a bunch of hands up. I'll try to go in the order of people have raised their hands. Yes. Oh, George Wallace. Okay, yes, I had forgotten that. Third-party candidates, 1968, Richard Nixon running against Hubert Humphrey. George Wallace formed, what do you call it, the American Independent Party, I think. And he won a number of states. And he did pretty well, even all southern states, but he did pretty well in some areas outside of the South. In a lot of Central Valley, California counties, he won up to 15, 20% of the vote in some of these counties. So yes, thank you for bringing that up. That was and then he ran again, and he got shot and paralyzed, which sort of undercut his next campaign. But he probably swayed that election. Yes. Yeah, great question. It's a question of this seemingly anti-intuitive pattern where we have poor states and often counties, at least if you're in the rich states, voting for the Republicans, who generally have a platform that is more favorable to wealthy individuals. This is something that a lot of people have written about. Some of you may have read the book, What's the Matter with Kansas, which precisely addresses this issue. Where in Kansas you have, it's a mid-income state, but it's very, very heavily Republican voting. There was one time back in the late 1800s where it had a strong populist, sort of left-leaning movement, but that disappeared and it became a real bulwark of the Republican Party. This book that I brought up, Andrew Gelman's Red State, Blue State, Rich State, Poor State, sort of tries to take that on and explain it. You'll say, well, even if you look at Kansas, actually, the poor people of Kansas do vote much more for the Democrats than the rich people of Kansas. But the poor in Kansas are voting about 50% for the Democrats and 50% for the Republicans, whereas the wealthy are voting about 70, 80% for the Republicans. His argument, and what's the matter with Kansas is, yes, it's precisely the cultural issues. It's abortion, it's gay rights, it's gun control. It's those issues. Gelman thinks that's simplistic, though, and he says we could just as easily say, what's the matter with Connecticut? What's the matter with Palo Alto? Why is it that these very wealthy areas are voting seemingly against their economic interests? And he says, yeah, well, it's for the wealthy, it's the cultural issues as well, too, that make the difference. Although I don't think we can really know. Individuals are voting for all kinds of reasons, and we can sort of try to aggregate those statistics. But yeah, that's a real central paradox, perhaps, or at least issue, something to think about. And again, something I'd really like to hear from the class, what sort of views you have on that. Thanks. I know there were some other hands up. Yes? How reliable are the polls? Yes, that's a great question. How reliable are polls overall? How reliable are these specific polls? Certainly in the current election, you got to take into account what is sometimes called the Bradley effect. After Tom Bradley, LA mayor, ran for California, African-American polls show that he was winning and he lost. So the Bradley effect will tells you that people will say to pollsters that they're going to vote for an African-American candidate. A certain percentage of them will go into the voting booth and won't do it. So that's specific to this election. In elections in general, sometimes the polls are dead on, but sometimes they're really wrong. They don't always call it. I mentioned the 1948 election where the polls showed that Dewey was going to crush Truman, and Truman won. And there have been some more recent cases of confounding of polls. I'm actually really sort of surprised that polls work as well as they do. It seems to me like a lot of people would say, none of your business who I'm voting for. Some people do say none of your business, but the pollsters sort of figure out who those people would be and put it into their equations to come up with a poll. It's being someone very interested in what's happening now. I'm checking the polls all the time. There's a number of websites. What's interesting is the Poll of Polls, which aggregates all the polls and gives you a number. But from one poll to another, there's some pretty major difference. I think Gallup is putting Obama ahead by 10 points. There are a number of other polls that's putting him ahead by as few as 4 points. And if you take the Bradley effect into play, and if that 4-point is true, then it's neck and neck. Well, overall, though, most polls are showing you sort of the data that I've shown, and actually some of those are aggregates. But yeah, it's a very important issue. Polls are imperfect. We all know that. Yes?
What about fraud in terms of results?
Voting fraud? Yeah, yes, okay. There certainly have been a lot of allegations of voter fraud. There were a lot of allegations from the Democrats in the 2000 election, and this is something we might talk about when we talk about that election. Republicans are making allegations of voter fraud now in terms of registering unregistered voters and doing that in a fraudulent way. Yeah, it's an issue, and especially if you have one of these real close elections like 2000, it can be huge. I mean, it can just decide the difference. And a lot of people do think that election was won by fraudulent means. Of course, the other party argues against that. Affects the maps very much, yeah. So that's just one of these unknowns. So take these maps, yes, with a grain of salt. Yes, sir?
But the question on voter fraud, I think, is a good one to take in historical perspective. Whatever you think voter fraud might be today, if you go back to Mayor Daley and Tammany Hall,
yeah, 1960, a real squeaker of an election. Kennedy just barely beat Nixon, and the story was Mayor Daley sort of guaranteed him enough votes from Chicago to win. Texas had a lot of irregularities in their voting as well. The losing candidate accepted the results in 60 and in 2000, and so it didn't become a huge issue. And you go, back earlier to the days of Tammany Hall, and it's interesting, there were an awful lot of presidential candidates who came out of New York who made their reputation fighting against Tammany Hall, fighting for good government. Some of those were Democrats, some were Republicans, but it was such an issue that became a campaign issue in and of itself, was the struggle against the political machines. Yeah, great comment. Yes, I believe so. Does anyone know? Are most polls done by phone?
Yeah, anyone ever been?
Well, the comment is, I was involved in a discussion with some people today about the fact that young people 28 and under don't have landlines. People 28 and older. And I was making phone calls for my candidate.
Yes?
They're all landline numbers.
Can you not do polls on cell phones?
Where do you get the phone number?
Oh, I never even thought of that. Well, that would totally mess up the poll, wouldn't it?
I don't know, maybe.
Well, the pollsters must have equations to take that into account, but I don't know how you do it. I mean, it's all really a mystery to me. I know my temptation would almost be to tell the pollster the opposite of what I think, because it just sort of irritates me, this notion that we're supposed to know how the election's going to come out before it happens. Yes, right. So the comment was 1932 election telephone polling showing Hoover beating FDR. It was quite the opposite. Well, pollsters have made a lot of advances since then. Yeah, right. But they still get beat sometimes. It doesn't always turn out the way they think. And the technology is changing, as was just brought up, and attitudes about polling change. So yeah, the pollsters are making advances, but the ground is shifting under their feet. So yeah, it's an important point to bring up. Yes. Yeah, the comment is there's more massaging of numbers in these polls, partly because pollsters are often finding themselves coming up with the wrong numbers. And the example was made of California primary, where Zogby had Obama doing very well based on the internet. Those people with access to the internet tending to be more favorably disposed to Obama versus those who don't have it, more favorably disposed to Clinton. That's the way it probably came out. So yeah, then they have to try to take all that into account. How well are they doing? We'll see at the end of the class. That's all I can say. We'll find out. Yes, on the back? Okay, so the comment is that the pollsters are getting the numbers off the voter registration cards, which presumably would include cell phone numbers. No. Yeah, how would you even know? Okay. Okay, I must admit, I'm over my head here in polling information. It's not something I've looked at very much, but thank you. Again, like I say, people in the class know more than I do. And so that's very helpful. I guess we're out of time, but thank you so much. Oh, a couple of comments. Again, I'd like to thank iTunes University. If you go to the website for the class, there's going to be a discussion feature. If you want to post comments or questions, you can do so. The reading assignment, the most important thing is really the Atlas of U.S. presidential elections. And we'll go through about half of that next week.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.